I am a huge fan of Nurgle models, especially from Age of Sigmar. And I'm also really interested in playing the Underworlds game. And when I saw the Wurmspat warband, I knew I had to paint them. The aim was to paint them more than just tabletop ready, but I didn't want to spend like 100 plus hours on this project. So how could I save some time and still have great looking models? Taking what I learned from John Nina's class at Adepticon, I tried to utilize undercoating to speed up the process. But instead of using his kind of quick, fast, dirty wet blending technique, I tried something a little bit different. Now, I used Pro Acryl dark purple sprayed from below, and then dark magenta sprayed from above in a zenithal highlight. With the models undercoated, it was time to start layering and highlighting. And I started with Fecula. The first test for this method would be her dress. Now I used thin layers and worked up to highlights, bouncing around the model. The aim was not perfect blending. I really wanted to keep the undercoat kind of visible in some areas and definitely in the deepest of recesses. Now I worked on her dress first, and then when I was happy with that, I moved on, to her skin and everything. And when working on all the other details, I would go back to the dress or the skin, and I would add to the highlights or the shadows. And the total painting time for this was about 4 hours. And as you can see, not all the blends are perfect, but I felt pretty good about this method, so I moved on to the next model. Now next up was Golgok. And where Fecula was primarily fabric, Golgok is primarily skin. And I started with the skin using mixes of Army Painter's Thicket Grove, Moon Petal, and Ice Yellow. I also used Pro Acryl's dark purple to blend those mixes into the shadow areas. Now, just like Fecula, I moved around the model pretty quick and making quick decisions. Now, once the skin was looking nice and gross, I moved on to the boots and the armor, and I refined areas as I went. Okay, it was at this point I decided to go with true metallics for all the metal bits and the weapons. And over the metals, I use diluted Pro Acryl orange oxide to give like a rust effect. Or I use diluted Pro Acryl's dark turquoise to give a verdigris effect. And while painting the final details, I would check previously painted areas for anything that looked like it needed some touch-ups. And for Golgok, the total painting time was again about 4 hours. Now the last model is Sepsimus. Now Sepsimus is primarily armor, and I was really excited to paint this one. This is kind of why I saved this one for last. The armor was the main focus for this model, and that's where I spent most of the time. The small amount of skin was of course painted first. And like the previous two models, I stayed pretty loose and tried to paint pretty quick. And I started with a light base coat of Pro Acryl's dark yellow green. And then I used Pro Acryl's dark purple to lower the value and Vallejo's ice yellow to raise the values. I mapped the highlights first and then loosely blended them into the midtones. And then I would use mixes of the dark yellow green and the dark purple to kind of glaze into the shadows. Once the armor was to a state where I felt it was pretty solid and it kind of read as non-metallic metal, I moved on to work on the rest of the details. And like the previous two models, I hit all the true metallics with the diluted orange oxide and dark turquoise. And total painting time again was about 4 hours. I'm pretty happy with that. Now all the bases were painted at the end. And for this I used Garagax Sewer contrast paint. I never know how to say that name. And then I picked out some of the details and bits like bugs and worms and mushrooms with Pro Acryl's mahogany and burgundy. And the final highlight for all those little bits and everything was Vallejo's reddish flesh. And the last step was I just added some tufts from Army Painter. They're the scorched tufts. I really like these because they're super dark and they really matched the overall vibe of the base. Now, after painting the rims black and a coat of matte varnish, the Wurmspat were finished. And the total project hours for this one was probably, I want to say about 13 and a half hours, which I'm extremely happy for. But, well, here's the final warband. Now, I'm definitely going to try this method again of using a kind of a zenithal undercoating with really interesting colors. And painting these warbands, it's great because it's, 3 to maybe 6 models, and you can invest some really good time. Now, you don't have to really invest hundreds of hours to get really good tabletop, playable models. I also like moving around the models very fast and being a little bit more loose with my painting. It's just refreshing from trying to always be hyper focused and every blend has to be perfect. These are supposed to be playable models, and I want them to look great on the tabletop, but not, horrific if you look at them up close. And this is really teaching my brain to function a little bit differently and not get hung up on certain areas. All in all, this was a really fun project, and it went faster than I thought it was going to, but I think that's it for this one. So I will see everyone later.